Okay, thank you for the invitation. And it's going to be a whistle stop through what is actually quite a big topic. But I suspect quite a few of you know quite a bit already, so hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. I've called it In Search of Shadows and Ghosts of Woodlands Past. And there is a backstory to this, which is work with the Forestry Commission, with the Woodland Trust, and with, I think it was An English Nature, now Natural England, looking at the nature of ancient woodlands, and in particular working with the Woodland Trust to produce an acceptable methodology to take to public inquiries where ancient woodland status was being challenged by, in my view, unscrupulous developers. So that was where some of the work came from, and a long-standing interest in woodlands. My own personal journey on this began at Lancaster University with the late Donald Piggott, obviously a great ecologist for the Cumbrian region, and being involved and interested in woodland ecology. But I then went on to develop contacts and friends and collaborators with a number of historians and historical geographers who were more interested in the social and historical aspects of woodlands. And at that time, the ecology and the history often didn't overlap. So I kind of developed this new excitement, if you like, about the history of woodlands and what a woodland was, things that as ecologists we didn't really ask about. And ultimately it led to ideas emerging of things like shadow woods, which I did a little book called Shadow Woods, A Search for Lost Landscapes. And this was kind of a culmination of some of the work that we've been doing. And the reason we were working on the evidence base was a way of actually understanding what a woodland was, but also finding a way that we could justify its designation as woodland. And it's a really important issue because our ancient woodlands are under threat. That is an ancient woodland in Sheffield, owned by the local authority. So that is what we were trying to avoid. It's full of archaeology. Just down the road, I've recently found 4 Iron Age barrows, a Neolithic long barrow, and a load of medieval stuff, totally unknown. And this site would have been full of similar unrepeatable archaeology, as well as the ecology and everything else. So it's really been a search to try and understand the nature of this resource. So we wanted to develop a methodology, and what the methodology showed us or indicated was that our ancient woodlands can be evidenced by things like indicator species back to the medieval. And we can be fairly confident with that. You walk into a woodland and you're fairly confident that you're in a medieval wood. The question then was, what was there before that wood? And this is kind of a question that people hadn't really been asking. And the answer is actually written in documentation like Doomsday, which is not always reliable. It's not spatially accurate. It's not uniform across the country. But what it does tell you about is a lot of open wood pasture and not a lot of enclosed wood. So that becomes quite important. But what we were finding was we were getting a glimpse into the pre-Doomsday countryside. And this is where the shadow woods idea came from, that actually the shadow woods that we were finding were unenclosed fragments of the Doomsday landscape. And also, once you got your eye in and once you could see these areas, you started to find them much more readily in areas like the Pennines and Peak District, which is my core case study area, but also elsewhere across the country, including Cumbria. And the other thing that we were doing was working with someone, again, who many of you will be familiar with, Franz Vera, on rewilding and the Oosterwaarderplassen experiment. And essentially what we were looking at now was a glimpse into pre-doomsday, which was very, very pertinent to the Vera argument. And yet, because most of the people doing rewilding were ecologists of various sorts, they hadn't looked at the history and they hadn't looked at doomsday. So this started to be quite exciting. And with shadows and ghosts in the landscape, basically the clues are there if you've got the eyes to see them. And once you've got your eye in, it becomes very obvious. I mean, I did lots of work looking at medieval landscapes and woodland crafts in ancient woodlands, things like charcoal burning. And once you get your eye in, you can spot charcoal hearths whilst you're moving a car at 50 miles an hour down a Welsh valley or something like that. It's amazing what you can see once you have the eyes to spot them. And with the shadows and ghosts, one of the things are the indicator plants, these species, which taken with some serious riders and qualifications, if you like, these can tell you a lot about woodlands in the landscape. Now, clearly, one of the things with indicators is that you need to bear in mind the geographic distribution and the climatic influence. So this is wood anemone, which in the Peak District is a very, very good indicator of ancient woodland. If I go to Norway, I've seen it growing on motorway verges quite freely. So depending on where you are, indicators can vary. And the way we get around that is to score their reliability at a local level and also to build up suites of species which start to tell the same story. It's quite important to have some clear definition. And what we said was a woodland is basically a treescape. It's a landscape with trees. And I have asked colleagues in the past about, and they say, oh, that's not a woodland. In the Peak District, we have lots of clough areas where the most of the trees have been removed. But the ancient woodland indicators tell you that in these steep ravines and often slightly damp shelter spots, you have the remnants of an ancient woodland. We then have an argument as to how many trees do you need to have a woodland and how far apart can they be? And I think the answer is they can be quite small and they can be quite a small number, and they can be a long way apart, and they're still a wood pasture, a woodland. Now, a wood is an area of woodland which is enclosed and protected. Usually, sometime just before doomsday, there's not many Saxon woods. There's wood pasture, but formerly managed woods, there's not many in the Saxon landscape. But there's a lot in the Norman landscape under the Norman feudal system, and a wood is enclosed from wood pasture. And the reason it's enclosed is because the human population is increasing from about the time of doomsday and the conquest to about the 1300s. It's a warm spell. The population is growing. The demand on resources is increasing, and communities are running out of wood and of timber. And therefore, the lord of the manor tended to start to protect the bits of woodland that were left. And these were enclosed as named woods. And you protect them with a bank, a ditch, a fence, a wall, or a hedge to keep out grazing animals, because the grazing animals will get in and they will do what the court rolls tell us is spoil ye wood. They'll eat the regrown coppice, for example, and they'll bark the bigger trees. So woods are enclosed from wood pasture round about that time. And this is ratified. It's not brought about, but it's ratified in a piece of legislation in the 1200s called the Act of Commons. Now, the woods are enclosed from wood pastures, and these are the areas which were predominant in the landscape before doomsday, and then they reduced down. These are generally common land, and a lot of our upland moors, for example, we now believe were wood pastures. They didn't have many trees, and the trees got more as you went down the hill, and they got fewer as you went up the hill. But a lot of accounts, like the accounts in the 17 and 1800s, talk of the uplands having large numbers of small trees, quite spaced out. In Derbyshire, we have people writing in the late 1700s and early 1800s, saying how the farmers hereabout have removed the smaller trees from these landscapes. They're actively removing them. We know from paleo evidence from pollen that there were good numbers of trees in these upland areas, in areas where by the late 1800s there were very few trees. So we need to sometimes revisit our view of what these upland landscapes look like. And of course, what you've had is centuries of drainage, which in the uplands is very easy. You just dig a ditch down the slope and the water runs away, but also burning for either sheep and or for grouse usually, and then heavy levels of grazing. So the combination of those changes from these open wood pasture landscapes to the more modern view of often single species areas of heather, bracken, purple moorgrass, matgrass, etc. So we need to revisit our understanding of some of these areas, and that's a typical wood pasture. That's a shadow wood area with hawthorns, which when you look at them are actually very old, with birch, often with multi-stemmed oak, and you're seeing amongst the bracken, bluebell, and there's also stitchwort and dog's mercury and honeysuckle and other woodland species. So we need to think about definition. Woods, as I say, are enclosed from the wood pastures, and these are the ancient woods today if they survive to the present time. However, being enclosed in, say, 1200 and being named maybe as the Manor Wood or the King's Wood or the Lord's Wood, some of these sites are then unenclosed. They may be lost to farming improvements, so they're unenclosed, cleared, stubbed, ploughed up. They may be lost in urban development. They may be lost to mineral extraction, etc., etc. Some are simply lost to the map. We have ancient woodlands which are now shrouded by secondary birchwood, and because they're actually not easily accessible from a footpath or a roadway, simply are not known. They've not been recognised. And we discovered one near Chatsworth Park, an area that some of you will be familiar with, and we got somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 veteran trees unrecorded, unrecognised. And so those are lost woods. What you sometimes get are what we call ghost woods. These are the remnants of where a wood used to be. And you can go into an area, maybe on the side of the hill, on the fell side, and you will find maybe archaeology, charcoal hearths, wood banks, medieval trackways from the people that lived and worked in those woodlands when they were working woods. But you also find indicator species. So quite often you find the boundary of the wood still exists in the landscape, with bluebells, wood anemone, stitchwort, and other species as what we call a ghost wood in that landscape. And that becomes very, very interesting because you can find ghost woods right into the core of cities like Sheffield. I've even found indicator species in roadside verges in the urban area and in people's front gardens. They get very interested when you explain what you're looking for. But from that, we came up with the idea of shadow woods. These are the areas which remain in the landscape, but are they were never really woods. They are remnants of wood pastures. And in that sense, they are even more exciting. They're even older than the ancient woodlands. And that's quite a powerful thing to discover in the landscape. And the shadow woods tend to be in specific areas which we can identify. I'll come back to that in a minute. There are practical implications of the findings. One is about natural regeneration. What we're finding is that when we go and look, if the conditions that have stopped trees growing, Oliver Rackham famously said that you don't need to plant trees to get a woodland, you just stop what stops trees growing. But when you stop whatever is preventing trees from growing, you will tend to get natural regeneration. It may need some pump priming, it may need some management intervention, but you will get natural regeneration. And excitingly, that natural regeneration very frequently seems to come back in the locations from which the trees were removed in the first place. And that has many implications for how we might manage future landscapes. One thing that we need to, I think, get our minds around, which is something we're discussing at our What is Wild conference next week, is the importance of the mosaic and then what you might describe as the dynamic instability in the landscape. The landscape experiences pulses, and these often are represented in wood pastures as periods of regeneration or periods of lack of regeneration. So the landscape is not necessarily stable. We often get changes over time with management or with climate change or other changes. If you have natural regeneration into one of these areas, then you've got a complete ecology ready and waiting for the new trees. Because if you simply plant trees in a landscape, it's random as to whether you're getting the mycorrhizal fungi, the microarthropods, the other associates, which make it really a wood or woodland. Whereas when you go to a shadow wood or even a ghost wood, if trees come back, then they're coming back with the ecology already there, pump primed. And one of the arguments that we've put across is that we have the ability to trigger massive tree and woodland regeneration at almost no cost. The trees come back more effectively, they grow faster, and it's almost free. You just need to stop what stops trees growing, and we have the potential to really make a very, very big difference quite quickly. With shadow woods and woodlands, these are different and distinctive, and many are remnant doomsday wood pastures. They're not woods as such, but wood pastures. So if you stop the grazing completely, they may be lost, the character may be lost. And if trees are planted and grazing excluded, then they shift from being wood pastures, which is what they've been for over 1,000 years, to something different. And when I give talks about the Peak District, I point out these fantastic areas of really bluebell woodland, which you see on either side of the Peak District as you go up the hill. You get them in North Wales and Mid Wales, a thing called Fred, above the level of the Coppice woodland. And if you go there in spring, you see swathes of bluebells up the hillside. So I point this out to people and they say, oh, we should plant trees on them. And you say, well, actually, no, what you want to do is just manage it to allow natural regeneration. But you also occasionally, to keep the unique character of these places, you need some grazing, not overgrazing, but they need pulses of grazing. This is where this instability, this dynamic instability, becomes so important. Just to finish with a few thoughts, we have dry woods in the landscape. These are dry shadow woods and ghost woods. Almost all these are underappreciated and recognised, including the wet woodlands, which I'll finish with. The dry woodlands are often on boulder slopes and scree slopes. And again, around Cumbria, you'll be familiar with that sort of habitat. Fell sides are often shadow woods with patches of woodland indicators. A lot of unimproved pastures, when you stand back and look at them, they're actually wood pastures. They have trees in them, and historically they were managed with grazing animals and trees. And there's a Cumbrian fell side, and I'm sure you can all see in the middle, we've got a nice patch of wood anemone. So that's the clue, that's the species there. And the bracken is tending to be a pseudo woodland over the top. And there's the shadow wood on the hillside. Now, if the management is more favourable, you could, over a few decades, have more trees and the indicators would populate that landscape quite effectively. Bracken beds are often remnant pseudo woodlands. They can guide you to where the soil conditions and the historic use of the land was woodland, because the bracken casts a dense shade over the more competitive species, and this allows the spring woodland flora to survive even in the absence of trees. One of the reasons that bracken is so pernicious and invasive is that it's a woodland species, but we've largely removed the trees, and it then goes, thank you very much, and will dominate a landscape. But its natural situation is not so dominant in a partial woodland canopy. And then gorse beds, again, have been described in Scotland as woodland in waiting. And quite often the successional change or the pulse in the landscape will be a trigger from gorse beds to a wood pasture. Now, just to finish with one of these particular examples, which is very, very much underappreciated, are the willow woods. We're doing some work in the lowlands on white willow, which is just absolutely amazing. We've got more invertebrates, dead wood invertebrates in our veteran white willows than most medieval deer parks, but that's a separate story. In the uplands, we get these amazing, probably Salix caprea, Salix cinerea hybrids, and that picture in front of you, there's only a handful of trees in there. There might be 4, 5 or 6 willow trees in there, and they are just spreading from central points across the landscape. And we think these are the rump of what was a much more widespread community, an ancient species rich community, very underappreciated. And it's what I describe as the Atlantic shadow. In the Peak District, we're getting the fag end of this. If you go west and north and south, then you really get seriously exciting willow woods. And they're often not marked as woodlands, they're often not appreciated as woodlands. But this is Low Bar in Cornwall, and just off picture to the right is the central point of that single tree. That is all one tree, and that is probably about 1/6 of it. And totally under-recorded, underappreciated, absolutely unique. So that is one of the shadow woods as well. There's lots more information on my website, on my blog, and on various other social media. So if you want to know more, do please take a look. Thank you for listening.